To the outside world, my father was the kind of man other men wanted to be. He had built Whitmore Logistics from a single refrigerated truck into one of the largest cold chain distribution companies in Western Canada. Warehouses in Calgary, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. Contracts with grocery chains, pharmaceutical distributors, government agencies. His name was on a donor wall at the University of Alberta. He shook hands with premiers and called them by their first names. I was 20 years old when he sat me down at the kitchen table, the same oak table where we used to do homework, where my mother used to leave notes before school, and told me I was no longer his son. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that stayed with me longest. He spoke the way he spoke in boardrooms. Measured. Final. He said I had embarrassed the family, that my choices reflected a weakness he didn't have the patience to accommodate, and that I should consider whatever was in my bank account that week to be the last money I would ever receive from him. He slid a folder across the table. It was a document terminating my position as a named beneficiary in his estate. He had already signed it. There was a line for my signature. I didn't sign it. I stood up. I walked out through the garage because I couldn't bear to pass through the front door like a guest being shown out. My sister was waiting in my car at the end of the driveway. She was 19. She had heard everything through the kitchen window she'd left cracked open. She didn't say anything when I got in. She just put her hand on my arm and kept it there while I drove. We ended up at a Tim Hortons off the highway because it was the only place either of us could think to go. We sat there until 2 in the morning, with our hands wrapped around cups that had gone cold, trying to figure out what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was a winter that nearly broke us. My sister moved in with a friend from university. I rented a room from a retired teacher in Sherwood Park who charged me $800 a month and left me strictly alone, which was all I could afford and all I wanted. I picked up shifts at a warehouse near the Yellowhead. Not one of my father's, I made sure of that, loading pallets of dry goods from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The work was honest, and it was brutal, and I was grateful for it because it left me too tired to think. My sister called twice a week. We didn't talk about our father much. There wasn't much to say that we hadn't already said 100 times in our heads. We talked about what she was studying, about which foods were cheapest at which grocery store, about a cat she was thinking of adopting. Our grandfather, our mother's father, lived 3 hours north of Edmonton, in a town called Barhead. He was a quiet man who had spent 40 years working in forestry, most of it in the bush around the Athabasca River Valley. He had hands like 2 slabs of raw pine, and he spoke slowly and always meant exactly what he said. He and my father had never liked each other. I never fully understood why when I was young. Later, I thought I did. He called me in February, on a Tuesday night when I was getting ready for my shift. His voice sounded careful in a way I wasn't used to. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was managing. He said that was not the same thing as being all right, and I said no, it wasn't. There was a long pause, the kind he was comfortable with in a way that most people aren't. Then he said he had something he wanted to tell me, but that it needed to be in person, and that I should bring my sister. We drove up on a Saturday. The highway north of Westlock was glazed with overnight frost, and the sky was the flat gray you only get in Alberta in February, the kind that sits on top of everything like a lid. My sister slept most of the way. When we pulled into his driveway, she woke up and looked at the house, the small bungalow with the woodpile stacked to the eaves, and said quietly, "I've missed this place." He made us breakfast. Scrambled eggs and toast and a pot of strong tea, and we sat at his kitchen table and ate, while he told us about his winter, the deer he'd been watching at the tree line, the repairs he'd made to the back fence. He let us settle before he said anything else. That was always his way. After we cleared the plates, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands and looked at us both for a moment. He told us that when our mother was alive, she had died when we were in elementary school, a brain aneurysm, the kind that gives no warning. She had spoken to him many times about her worries, about my father, about the company. about the way certain things were done at Whitmore Logistics that she didn't understand and that no one would explain to her. She had never said anything directly to us because she was trying to protect us. But she had said things to him. He said he had spent years not knowing what to do with what he knew. My father was powerful, well-connected, and the kind of man who could make life difficult for people who got in his way. Our grandfather was a retired forester in Barhead. The imbalance was obvious, but he had not stopped watching, and he had not stopped collecting. He got up and went to the back bedroom. He came back with a metal document box, the kind with a combination lock, the flat gray kind you can buy at any Staples. He set it on the table between us. He said he had made copies of everything inside and stored them with his lawyer in town. He said the box and everything in it was for us, and that he had been waiting until he thought we were ready, and that he believed we were ready now. That was intentional, I realized later. He wanted it to be ours. My sister and I drove to a pull-off on the highway about 20 minutes south of Barhead, with the fields flat and white on both sides and no other cars in sight, and we opened it there. I had expected financial documents. What we found was more than that. There were printed emails, dozens of them, organized in chronological order with handwritten tabs. There were bank statements for numbered companies my father had never mentioned in any family conversation I could remember. There were contracts with cold chain clients that included invoices for services that, as far as I could tell from the descriptions, had never actually been delivered. There were records of payments made to individuals identified only by initials. Some of them, I would later learn, were provincial government procurement officers. There was a hand-drawn organizational chart in my grandfather's slow, careful printing showing how money moved from Whitmore Logistics through a series of shell companies registered in Alberta and one in the Northwest Territories, and where it ended up. There was also a USB drive. I looked at my sister. She was holding one of the printed emails with both hands, reading it with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, exactly. Something more like the moment when something you suspected for a long time turns out to be true, and the confirmation is worse than you expected, and somehow also exactly what you expected, both at once. He was bribing them, she said. The procurement contracts. He was bribing them to win the government distribution contracts. Some of them, I said. Maybe all of them. She set the email down carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust yourself not to crush it. We sat there for a long time with the heater running and the fields going dark on both sides. I want to be honest about what I felt in that car. I want to say it was clarity, or purpose, or the clean fire of someone who knows exactly what they have to do, but it wasn't that, not right away. What I felt was grief, not for my father, for the version of him I had needed to believe in when I was a child, for the house I grew up in and the family I thought we were, for my mother, who had seen something was wrong and hadn't lived long enough to see it made right. My sister reached over and turned off the heater. "We're going to have to be very careful about this," she said. She was right. We needed help, and we needed to be smart about who we asked. Over the following 3 weeks, we did everything methodically. My sister had taken a year of business law before switching programs, and she still had her textbooks. I spent 3 nights reading the sections on corporate fraud and public procurement. We made a list of what we knew, what we could prove, and what we would need someone else to verify. The USB drive contained scanned copies of internal communications, emails from a personal account my father apparently used for sensitive correspondence, along with what appeared to be a second set of books, maintained separately from the official Whitmore Logistics financial records. My grandfather had obtained them through a source he never identified to us, and whom he had apparently promised to protect. We honored that. We never asked. We contacted the RCMP's commercial crime section through their online tip line first, anonymously, to understand whether what we had constituted a viable file. The response was cautious but not dismissive. They wanted original documents, not copies. We contacted a lawyer. This part is harder to talk about because it took several tries and several rejections, before we found someone willing to take our case on contingency. Most of the firms we approached in Edmonton did work for companies like my father's. One lawyer we met with actually called my father's company a valued client of ours, while we were sitting in his office, as though that were a normal thing to say to the people sitting across from him. We thanked him and left. The lawyer who eventually took our file was a woman who ran a small practice in St. Albert, focused on whistleblower cases and civil litigation against corporations. She had short gray hair and an unhurried manner, and she read every page of what we brought her without saying a word for 45 minutes. When she finally looked up, she said, "This is serious. This is provable. And you should know that under the Alberta whistleblower protection legislation, you may have significant legal protections once you file." She paused. "You should also know that your father will fight this with everything he has." "We know," my sister said. We filed the formal report with the RCMP's Commercial Crime Section in late March. We turned over the original documents. We gave our statements. We were told to say nothing publicly, to continue our normal lives, and to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. I went back to my warehouse shifts. My sister went back to class. We talked on the phone more than we ever had before, sometimes for 2 hours at night, going over everything again, reassuring each other that we had done the right thing, that the documents were real, that the case was solid. Some nights I believed it completely. Some nights I lay awake in my rented room in Sherwood Park, listening to the furnace run and wondering if we had made a catastrophic mistake. The investigation took 11 months. I won't pretend I understood everything that happened during that time. The RCMP worked with the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team and the Federal Competition Bureau. There were aspects of the investigation that touched on federal procurement contracts for pharmaceutical cold chain distribution, which brought in additional agencies. Our lawyer kept us informed as much as she was able to. Mostly we waited. He was arrested on a Wednesday morning in February, almost exactly a year after our grandfather had called to tell me he had something to say. I found out through a news alert on my phone. Whitmore Logistics CEO, arrested on charges of fraud, breach of trust, and bribery of government officials. There were 11 charges, 4 of them related to federal contracts. 3 of the procurement officers who had accepted payments were arrested the same day in coordinated operations. His lawyer issued a statement saying he would be defending himself vigorously. I was in the parking lot of the warehouse when I read it. I sat down on the tailgate of someone's truck. I didn't even know whose, and stared at my phone for a long time. My sister called me 30 seconds later. She had seen the same alert. She didn't say anything for a moment, and neither did I. "Grandpa knew," she finally said. "He always knew." "Yeah," I said. "He did." There is something I want to say about what happened with the company, because it matters and because I have seen the question come up when people discuss stories like this. Under Canada's whistleblower legislation, individuals who report corporate fraud that results in government financial recovery may, in certain circumstances, be eligible for a percentage of the recovered funds. Our lawyer had advised us of this from the beginning. We hadn't reported what we found because of the money. We reported it because it was the right thing to do, and because our grandfather had spent years keeping those documents safe for exactly this purpose, and because our mother had worried in silence, and we could not afford to do the same. The financial recovery aspect was handled entirely by our lawyer. We received word of it months after the arrest, quietly, through a formal letter. I am not going to say the number. What I will say is that it was enough to change the trajectory of both our lives, and that the first thing my sister did when she found out was cry and then call our grandfather. He said, the way he always said things, "Good, I'm glad it worked out." The trial lasted 4 months. Our father was convicted on 7 of the 11 charges. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison plus 3 years of supervised release, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from serving as a director or officer of any corporation in Canada. The company was placed into receivership. The donor wall at the University of Alberta was quietly updated. I was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I had thought about being there, considered it for a long time, decided against it. I didn't need to see his face at that moment. I didn't need anything more from him. I think that was the day I understood the difference between justice and revenge. Justice is a process. It's institutional. It exists beyond the two of you. Revenge keeps you in the room. I didn't want to be in the room. My sister and I had a dinner at our grandfather's house that weekend instead. He made a roast, the same one he had made for every occasion our whole lives, with the same canned green beans he always served alongside it because, as he always said, they're fine and there's nothing wrong with them. We ate around his small kitchen table, and he told us about the deer again, and a book he was reading about the fur trade, and we didn't talk about the verdict much because we didn't have to. After dinner, while my sister and he were doing dishes, I sat on his back step with a cup of tea and looked out at the tree line. It was dark and cold, and the stars were sharp and clear the way they only get in northern Alberta in winter when the air is still. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had worried quietly for years about something she didn't have the words to fully name, and how her father had listened and had waited and had believed that eventually the truth of it would matter to someone. I thought about the fact that the someone turned out to be us. My sister came out and sat beside me. She had her coat on and her hands around a mug. We sat there for a while without talking. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Yeah? Our last name." I looked at her. She looked at me. "It's his name," she said. "It's the company name. It's on those indictments. I don't want it." I thought about that for a moment, about what it means to carry a name, about whether a name is something you inherit or something you choose. "What would you want instead?" I asked. She looked at the tree line. Mum's name, Grandpa's name. Our mother's maiden name was Calloway. It was our grandfather's name too, the name on his mailbox, the name above the woodpile, and the bungalow and the back step we were sitting on. It was the name of someone who had spent 40 years working in the cold and the quiet, who had never bribed anyone for anything, who had kept a metal document box in his back bedroom for a decade and a half because he believed his grandchildren would eventually need what was inside it. We changed our names the following spring. The process in Alberta is a straightforward one: a court application, a fee, a waiting period, a certificate. It took about 6 weeks. When the certificate arrived in the mail, I held it for a long time before I opened it. I was no longer a Whitmore. I was Calloway, same as my grandfather, same as my mother, same as the name I should have always had. Some inheritances are not given to you at the moment they are meant to be received. Some of them are set aside, carefully, by someone who loves you and is willing to wait as long as it takes. The greatest thing my grandfather left us was not in that metal box. It was the fact that when everything fell apart, we already knew where to go. We already knew whose table to sit at and whose voice to trust. That kind of inheritance doesn't come with a dollar amount. It doesn't come with a deed or a certificate or a contract. It lives in the way a person treats you when you show up at their door with nothing. And it turns out that when you've had that, really had it, even once, no one can ever take it away.